Hay algo que se está moviendo en la economía, pero que casi nadie ve venir. Dicen que lo peor ya pasó, pero los datos empiezan a contar otra historia. ¿Y si en 2026 el enemigo no es ni la recesión y la inflación, sino algo que pocos están teniendo en cuenta y que es quizá una combinación de las dos? Atentos a la entrevista en exclusiva en el canal al economista jefe de Allianz Global Investors, Christian Schulz, que he tenido la ocasión de charlar con él en Frankfurt, en la sede de Allianz Global Investors. ¿Qué es lo que viene para la economía? ¿Qué se puede esperar para los mercados? ¿Cuáles son los riesgos que tenemos que tener en cuenta pensando en ese foco del año próximo? El riesgo está justo donde nadie está mirando y lo que viene podría cambiarlo absolutamente todo. Las políticas monetarias, los mercados y tu dinero. 2026 puede ser el año que haga despertar a todos. Todo eso es lo que vamos a ver en la próxima entrevista a continuación. Quédate en el vídeo que no te va a decepcionar. ¿Qué tal? Muy buenas a todos. Hoy traigo un capítulo bastante especial al canal y espero que os guste bastante porque estamos intentando aportar mucho valor añadido. Estamos en las oficinas de Allianz Global Investors y estamos con su economista jefe, que es Christian Schulz, con un currículum intachable y que nos va a hablar de la macro de Estados Unidos, de cómo está la situación, de los mercados, de todos los riesgos que hay en el horizonte próximamente. Así que pues espero que os guste, que dejéis vuestro apoyo dando un like, que tardáis muy poco en dar ahí un like, en suscribiros al canal y en dejar vuestro comentario de qué os parece lo que vamos comentando y espero que os guste porque este tipo de entrevistas pues son de mucho valor y cuesta mucho hacerlas, así que valoradlo por ahí. Dicho esto, pues vamos a presentar al invitado y vamos a dar la bienvenida. Hi, Christian, it's a pleasure to having you in my channel and to talk about macroeconomic, the economic scenario and the current situation that is very interesting right now.
Yep, Hector, very glad to be here. I'm all excited about your questions and hope that we can do something interesting for your viewers.
First of all, I want to ask you about the overview in the economy. We saw mainly in the United States a slowdown in the labor market. And what's your opinion and your analysis related with the current situation in the labor market in the US? Do you think we could see maybe more a slowdown in this area?
There is a slowdown, that's clear. It's also clear that this slowdown is also visible in labor demand. That's very important. I think it's a consequence of the Fed's fight against inflation, so of the high interest rates that we've now had for quite a period of time. That was inevitably eventually going to slow the economy. It's quite incredible for how long the US economy resisted it, but I think it's increasingly showing in the labor market that companies are holding off hiring. So there's a lack of demand. Of course, there is also a labor supply component to it. So the number of people available to the labor market at the moment is falling because of the US administration's immigration policies. And that means we have to kind of recalibrate how we look at the labor market data, right? Because in the past, you would have expected 150,000 or so jobs per month to be what you need in order to keep the unemployment rate stable. Because of the lack of labor supply at the moment, the lack of immigration, that number has dropped and probably dropped considerably, maybe even to zero. So that means, a slowdown in the labor market, even if it's demand driven, by itself may not be enough to reduce inflation. And therefore, it's a question whether the Fed has really done its job yet.
With tariffs, maybe some companies want to maybe first to cut hires and then to lay off the labor force. So you think there is a risk in order to have a recession next year, or maybe we have soft landing with this scheme?
I think markets are convinced that it's going to be a soft landing or even no landing. I think, for us, the view is that the recession risk is maybe somewhat underestimated. The tariffs, when they were announced in April, triggered a big market downturn, also dollar downturn. Now we've got the same tariffs that were announced then, and it seems that everything is well. People are paying the taxes, the tariffs. We can see that the revenue in the US is 400 billion on an annualized basis, 1 or 2% of GDP. So there's massive tariffs being paid, yet we can't see who's paying them yet. We would expect at some point consumers to carry a big burden there, so prices will go up, that weighing on real incomes and consumer spending. And but so far there's no sign of that. So maybe at the moment it's either because there's still inventories of old goods which were imported on no tariffs, so the tariffed goods aren't being sold yet. Maybe it's the exporters that are carrying some of the, maybe the middlemen, so margins in the US. But wherever it hits in the end, I think the risks are underappreciated that these tariffs will still slow the economy more than people think, and recession substantially. Yet that being said, it's not our base case that we fall into recession.
Another question related with that is we changed the cycle in the interest rates, first here in Europe and then in the US. We are in a cut cycle. So what's your perspectives in that sense with the cut cycles? How could affect to the economy and also to the markets?
Yeah, we've seen two interesting changes in reaction function, or the way central banks react to economic data over the summer on both sides of the Atlantic. So we had in Jackson Hole, Mr. Powell saying, where previously he'd said, we've got two mandates, price stability and the job market or full employment. Which one we see more critically depends on how far away we are from each target. And clearly they're much further away from the inflation target than they are from the employment target. And so they were calibrated, they were focused on getting inflation down. In Jackson Hole, that kind of reversed. And suddenly they're focused on the labor market. So the labor market is it now. We've talked about it. It's slowing. So the Fed is resuming the rate cuts when inflation is still quite high and may even start rising again. There's a high risk of a policy error, but for the time being, people see it as soft landing, job done, economy will re-accelerate next year. And in Europe, we've seen the ECB, which was cutting interest rates because inflation was too high, now projecting that inflation is going to be too low for the next 2 years, and yet not cutting interest rates anymore. Saying, it's fat finger, or fat 1.9%. We don't have to worry about inflation or deflation or look too low in inflation. And also there, I think there's a risk of a policy error. It just seems to me that the damage done by these two policy errors are quite different. The one from the ECB, I would still see as negligible, the error, if it's done. On the Fed side, I think the risks are higher.
And also we've seen the devaluation of the dollar. Maybe we've seen a similar movement the next year with the dollar.
Difficult to see at the moment how the dollar is going to recover. Obviously, in the very long run, the dollar is not, out of kilter with its long-run average against the euro, so it's nothing dramatic here. But yes, the ECB is done with the rate cuts. It's turned hawkish. The Fed's only resuming, and it's very dovish. That's not supportive for the dollar. Economic trajectory, we've just seen more data from Europe, the purchasing manager indices, which suggest that the European economy is chugging along nicely. In the US, we've got the slowing labor market. That's also not supportive for the dollar. And then there is all these questions about the institutional framework in the US, Fed independence, the tariffs. We're going into election next year. What about fiscal policy? So I think, structurally we're quite bearish on the dollar versus the euro. And conversely, there are some positive stories running for the euro at the moment as well.
And what's your base case scenario for the next year in United States and also in global economy?
I think we're still of the view that growth will be challenged on both sides of the Atlantic and globally because of the tariffs. The tariffs are what we call a supply shock for the US economy, so higher prices, therefore lower growth. And for the rest of the world, it's a demand shock, so lower growth, therefore lower prices. And from that, you can already tell where we're going, right? So our base case is that we will have a stagflationary impulse in the US. Lower growth, higher prices, and for the rest of the world also lower prices, but also lower growth, but lower prices as well. That gives you quite different environments also when it comes to financial markets, right? Past stagflationary environments in the US have not always been good, or in fact mostly not been good for equities, also not for bonds, but they have been good for foreign assets sometimes, and especially, of course, for gold. But in the rest of the world, we have a different scenario, right? In some parts, we have more recessive tendencies, lower growth, lower inflation, and in others, like in Europe, we almost think that growth is going to accelerate somewhat next year because of fiscal stimulus, especially here in Germany.
So you think we have a similar scenario than the 70s, or more or less, or you don't think so?
There are elements of the 1970s, right? We've now come out of a massive inflation shock, and in the US there's a bit of a risk that we ease off too early and that a second wave is coming. Also, there's a risk, I think, that supply shocks are mistreated or misdiagnosed as demand shocks by the government. So, you slow the economy because of tariffs, and in order to compensate, you give people checks to spend more money. Right? That would push up inflation even more, and risk of de-anchoring inflation expectations, and then a very expensive fight against inflation in the long run. So I think there are elements of this. But at the same time, I think there's also big differences. We've got an administration committed to keeping energy prices low, and so far, oil prices, for example, have fallen since Donald Trump came to power, probably more because of demand than supply, but there's more coming, I think, on that side. There's deregulation, there's the AI revolution that should boost productivity. So I don't think you can quite compare it with the 1970s. There's just too many other elements to this.
One element, if the sovereign debt, maybe, there are a lot of analysts that said that there is a huge risk in the sovereign debt. They maybe could explode in the future, mainly the long-term fixed income products. Do you think there is a risk in the debt space, in the public debt?
Well, at the moment, we're still in this world where if growth slows, if the Fed cuts interest rates, you'd see more support for the long end of the curve, right? So if anything, we're actually quite constructive on duration at the moment. That being said, we have to prepare for risks here. It does seem that, for example, we have to prepare for the risk of high inflation, so we have to protection against that. We also have to protect ourselves against new bouts of volatility like we had around Liberation Day. Right? There's just too many event risks in the US, court rulings. Imagine that we've got a court ruling next year from the Supreme Court says that the US tariffs are illegal and that they have to be repaid. Right? That would completely change the fiscal story for the US again. So we're protecting ourselves against that with steepness in the US curve, so long the short end and not so long the long end, if you like. So I think you have to prepare for that. But at the moment, as I said, lower growth, rate cut cycle the renewed rate cut cycle at the Fed give you support for bonds. Yeah,
and moving to the stock markets, because you mentioned before the AI area, there is a question that a lot of people are making right now, which is the stock markets are in a bubble right now, maybe in terms of index. In the US, the S&P 500 are in the all-time highs, and also the Nasdaq and the all indexes. Yep. So is there a bubble in the stock market?
We're also concerned about valuations. We would at least diversify away from the US. At the moment, for example, we think that there's good opportunities in the equity world in emerging markets. A few quarters ago, we were overweight Europe, for example, which worked well. So it's definitely a time to diversify away. At the same time, this revolution, AI revolution, is something that we think could, if anything, still be underappreciated. How important this is, and because clearly there's going to be setbacks in this new technology, but the long-term impacts, I think, are becoming clearer as companies start applying AI. So it's no longer just about the firms that create the models or that create the infrastructure for the models, but we think that's increasingly also the benefits of AI, and the performance in the stock market will come from companies that implement and use AI. So the valuations definitely a concern, definitely something that one should diversify away from, but the underlying story of this technological revolution is still there, and these other firms carrying the US stock market, and rightly so.
So in this stagflation scenario, with this risk that we have and that we are facing off the next year, you think we need to have more exposure to hard money, to gold, silver, Bitcoin, real estate assets, some kind of things for the next year?
Yeah, gold for sure. The stagflationary elements of the scenarios certainly support that. Hard currencies, to which At the moment, I would certainly count the euro are also beneficiaries. So yes, we're constructive on the euro and a few other currencies. Indeed, I mean, stagflation, these are the kinds of assets that perform. And I think more broadly, a diversification away of assets from the US to other markets. You have to be tactical about it, right? At the moment, for instance, we're a little bit skeptical on Europe because of the French political turbulences and potentially rating downgrades that are yet to come. But yeah, also structurally constructive on Europe.
And what other opportunities that we could have exposure in our portfolios for the next year, taking into account this scenario?
Well, I think what Donald Trump, also in the second term, is advancing is this deglobalization and de-dollarization of the world. Right? The U.S. does not want to be the stabilizer, or the U.S. consumer is no longer the lender of last resort to the rest of the world. The U.S. is no longer the defender of the rest of the world. And therefore, the rest of the world has to do it itself. And particularly when it comes to Europe, I think there is this has been a wake-up call, and there is action. European sovereignty is one of the topics that we think is very important again in 2026. And we call it European Sovereignty 2.0 because it broadens out from defense to sectors such as aerospace, healthcare, healthcare sectors. So there's other and digital, of course, as well, where Europe will have to do the things themselves, and lots of money will be thrown at this, and investors can benefit from that.
So thank you very much for your time. I think it's pretty interesting what you said. So thank you again for being in my channel, and it has been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Hector.
Pues muchísimas gracias a todos, espero que os haya gustado el vídeo, que si habéis llegado hasta el final con todo esto que hemos comentado, que ha estado fantástico, esta entrevista en Frankfurt, dejar vuestro like, suscribiros al canal y dejar vuestro comentario de qué os ha parecido y eso, like, comentario y suscribiros. Nos vemos en el próximo vídeo, espero que comentéis.